afternoon, everybody, evening or morning, wherever you're dialing in from. We're like to welcome you to Palo Alto and to Stanford Law School virtually. My name is Mike Callahan. I'm the professor of the practice and executive director of the Rock Center here at Stanford Law School. We're delighted to be a part of this first 24-hour global webinar from GCGC and ECGI, and picking up the tail end here for those of you who may have stayed up all night on this important topic of COVID-19 crisis and its aftermath in corporate governance. I'd like to also thank Professor Ron Gilson, who brought this opportunity to us at the Rock Center. I'm joined today by a distinguished guest, Louise Pentland, who I will introduce in a moment. Just a couple of logistics items for our session. We will cover several topics in a fireside chat format for about 30 minutes or so, and then really like to have an interactive session in terms of Q&A. You all know to use the Q&A tabs, please, or raise your hand, and I will do my best to moderate, either ask you to unmute and ask your question, or try to call or read the question from the queue. So with that, let me introduce our guest today. Louise is the Executive Vice President and Chief Business Affairs and Legal Officer of PayPal, bringing more than 20 years of leadership experience in the C-suite across innovative global technology companies. In her role at PayPal, she is responsible for the global people, legal, communications, intellectual property, government relations, and social innovation functions. Quite a remit, Louise, that you have. She was recently recognized as one of the top 50 most powerful women in technology. The Financial Times recognized Louise as one of the top 30 general counsels globally in 2016, and one of the top 50 general counsels in the United States by the National Law Journal. Before joining PayPal, Louise served as Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer at Nokia Corporation, where she managed a global team of 400 plus in 30 countries, and where I had the pleasure of working across from Louise on some transactions and got to know her then. In addition to her roles at PayPal, and why I think she's a particularly interesting speaker for today's session, is she's also a member of the board of directors of Hitachi since 2015. So across several continents and across several different professional contexts. Louise, thank you for joining us. And I'd like to start at a high level with a question about the approach that you led as the Chief Legal Officer and Business Affairs Officer of PayPal as it became clear over the last several weeks that this pandemic would be the global humanitarian tragedy and a historic business event that we perhaps don't know what the consequences will be yet. How did you go about starting to prioritize and prepare PayPal's response as an executive team working with the board and more broadly across the company?
So look, a couple of things. We have global operations. So we started to obviously see what was happening in China first. I think, we, like many others, perhaps looking back, probably couldn't have believed it evolved across the world the way it has. So we had a little bit of time to sort of prep and think through how you might evolve this situation. We also, I think several years ago, I think perhaps, fortuitously, the nature of our business is we do have a lot of crisis management activities. And so we put together a team, a really top-notch team of people several years ago to deal with things like hate groups, how would we react in a crisis situation? And so we've had an intact team in place who could finish each other's sentences for the last 3 years, and we leveraged that team. And that team came together in January, and we stood that up as our COVID sort of steerco, and they have sort of basically been, working shifts 24/7 to sort of deal with every issue that came up, and it literally evolved hour by hour. It was not even day by day, and it sort of went from a complete denial of us executives to there's no way we could all work from home to we're all working from home, and now what does that mean? And so I think it's sort of for PayPal, operating globally, it's sort of required I think such an intensity of sort of response. I think having a crisis management team has truly benefited us in a way that I think we couldn't have imagined when we originally set that up.
And is there, as you've thought about for a company like yours that as you mentioned, so many different geographies, touches consumers, small business, governments, large enterprise clients, is there an overarching principle that you and the board have been working through as you think about how to address a crisis like this, which has to be one that's sort of unforeseen, I would think, unless PayPal knew more than everybody else at the time?
We absolutely did not. We absolutely did not. I think it's sort of quite unifying that we're all in the same spot. Look, I think what has sort of really come to the surface more than anything else is that actually, if you're a company with strong values, this likely is carrying you through right now. And what I mean by that is, one of the things that we sort of really doubled down our focus on was, our values mean we support our employees first, and then our customers. And if we have healthy employees, then we can help our customers. And we actually approached it, not even, I would say, consciously, but just by the fact that our values are so embedded globally, by making sure our employees were safe first. What did we have to do to make sure that that happened? And I think that was actually in conversations with our board as well. One of the, I would say, the most sought after question and answer was around, what are you doing for your employees? And I think that is the right question to ask. And then very quickly that evolved to, especially in a company like PayPal, which is at the forefront of, digital commerce. And now suddenly you've got an entire globe at home, not able to go to shops. How could we turn that into an opportunity to support people in those situations where people don't want to touch or handle cash anymore, or where they don't want to touch, credit card machines? I think it's in our DNA. It's our DNA. It's what we do. It's what we exist to do. Is e-commerce. So it created an opportunity for us to really think about what could we do to support the companies in our that we currently support, and the companies that we currently don't support, and how could we use this as a galvanizing moment? And what emerged from that were a couple of things. If you take the United States as an example. As we all know, and we've been following, the SBA stood up with the government's plans around giving small businesses access to loans, and one of the biggest constraints on that has been how to get access to that. We were not an SBA government approved entity. In a few short weeks, we stood ourselves up so that we could reach our merchants to give them access to this funding in a much more streamlined way. Similarly, we've been having conversations now with Treasury, and we've been able to set up an opportunity for existing PayPal customers, or if you want to become a PayPal customer, to get your stimulus checks, right? Because that's one of the things that has sort of been a focus for the government. So it's created these sort of really interesting opportunities, and it's proving to us very interestingly, and to our board, that with the right focus, you can actually do a lot of things you always said you couldn't do. And I think, we have a mixed population of call center employees, engineers, and, what I consider sort of, support or enabling functions globally. And we're about, evenly split between our, our hourly customer support workers and our, engineering and professional development organizations. And what we see with that is we've got to help both groups, equally, obviously. But we thought it would be harder to put the hourly call center workers in their homes, and it was hard, and I'm not going to pretend it wasn't, but we got it done. And as we learned through this process, where we've had contingencies in the past, we operate in China, we operate in the Philippines, and we had these fail safes, like, well, if China went down, it would move over to India. Well, everybody went down at the same time. So that forced us to actually have to enable an organization sort of setup. And it was remarkably inspiring to see, you know, how people did that. So I think, you know, all of that has sort of been, you know, something we've shared with the board, that they've supported, and you know, I think it creates a new normal.
And that, so you raised an interesting point, which is the next question I wanted to get to, which is, as you're aware, starting some time ago, and particularly brought to the forefront in the fall with the Business Roundtable statement about this broader role for corporation in society, and an endorsement of stakeholder inclusion. And I know it was part of the sessions earlier today to talk a little bit about that. This new normal, it's certainly an opportunity to test that dynamic for corporations. And so do you see it as a board member and as an executive that this is going to be the sea change that forces all companies, even if they're not ones that approach this world in a broader stakeholder way to begin with, to start to act that way, or it's more transactional? Like, what's your perspective on how this will evolve from a corporate governance standpoint?
Yeah, look, I think from a corporate governance perspective, I think it's sort of been interesting. You know, one of the early anecdotes on the corporate governance side has been around, you know, everyone who didn't do virtual shareholder meetings now scrambling to get onboarded with shareholder meetings. And, you know, we at PayPal have done those since we spun off from for 8 years. We've done virtual shareholder meetings. So suddenly this became a new expertise to sort of tell other companies how to do it. And so I've spent a fair bit of time, you know, supporting, you know, other blue chip companies as they're sort of, you know, having to fast track this experience, which, you know, we took months and months and months to sort of, you know, do, and we do every year. So I think from a corporate governance side, I think that's an interesting dimension to watch. You know, it's certainly, you know, I think a lot of focus around disclosures, and making sure that, you know, companies, you know, I think the new normal there will be about crisis management. You know, what are companies doing? Nobody could have anticipated this. So I don't think anyone should be penalized or made to sort of, you know, suffer consequences as a result of this. This couldn't have been anticipated, but now it's here. Now we got to anticipate it. And of course, there's a lot of speculation around, you know, is there going to be a second wave? Happens, you know, if you bring a work back and they get sick. You know, I was talking with, you know, a few of my GC colleagues recently where, you know, somebody's CEO caught COVID, and what are your disclosure requirements around that? So I do think that it opens up a new aperture for corporate governance. I don't think there's a great overcorrection, but I do think it creates new opportunities for us to think about how do we leverage, you know, sort of risk and risk management, and it's a new dimension, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit about that risk management piece? So obviously one of the core responsibilities for the board, and at least in all the years that, and I was at GC4, we had business continuity planning, but nothing that took into account pandemic, at least that I'm aware of. And so how are you starting to think about that from a board level, try to broaden out that risk management perspective, or things that you're seeing there in that development?
Yeah, so I'll answer the question from two perspectives, one relative to PayPal, and then the other one with my Hitachi board hat on. You know, I think I think it creates some new behaviors for board members. I think they have, you know, a greater responsibility to ensure that they really do understand how and what is going to happen and when in these situations. And I think, look, I would venture to say most companies have a playbook for some type of business continuity risk, you know, situation. And I think most of us leverage that as best we could. I think boards now are going to be forced to really consider that, you know, a pandemic, you know, is not a sort of a once in 100 years issue now. So how do you think about creating programs that will anticipate this, right? We're now all on notice, so there's no turning this back. But at the same time, I think most of us have gotten real life experience from going through this, and from being on the, kind of the cutting edge of these issues, that actually I think it will make it easier. And I think what will make it easier is actually, I don't think we're going to go back to the way it was before. I don't see a certain, sort of reversal of, a sort of a global workforce being more distributed. I think that is the new normal. What I do think it will force boards to think about is things like, people location strategies. If you are on a board of a global company, you need to really think about, where's your employee concentration? Because if your employee concentration is over-indexed, right, then you're going, and that country goes, down in any way, it's, as we learned, there is no fail-safe for this. So the fail-safe actually is that you have a distributed workforce plan, and it's certainly, for PayPal, we're absolutely thinking about what is our geographical strategy going forward. We don't expect, everyone to come back and just work in an office again. Nor do I think we want that, actually. With which is a Japanese-based company, very, very, I would say, traditional in some ways, in terms of, how they do board meetings, how they, get my signature on documents. Suddenly overnight, they're doing video conferencing, which is really quite progressive, using things like DocuSign to get documents signed, and where countries in sort of institutionalized sort of practices have been the norm, right? Getting a wet signature is the norm. Using DocuSign is not the norm. Then these sort of, board pressures are going to, if you want an international board, you are going to have to accommodate these types of changes. And those are the sorts of things that I think boards now need to really think about, in terms of where this new normal starts to take us.
It's you mentioned human capital, and it's something I wanted to ask you about, since in your role, you also have responsibility for the human resources side at PayPal. And it's been a governance topic of increasing importance, particularly around, but focused more on issues of skills gaps and growing inequality, particularly in the US and other parts around the world, and how boards were going to, perhaps in part of a broader stakeholder inclusion model, start to think about the community around them. In the wake of a pandemic where you have now perhaps mass unemployment, perhaps the skill sets are going to be different that you need in a global company. How is PayPal or others in your network thinking about that human capital challenge in terms of the boardroom? Is it different kinds of expertise? Is it a new vertical that gets picked up in all the committee meetings? Like, practically, what do you think is going to happen there?
I think it just, I think, having done this for a really long time, like yourself, Mike, I think there's always new risks that emerge, right? When I think about, even the last couple of years, risks like, data privacy and cybersecurity, I think those risks, they get added to the portfolio. So my anticipation is this becomes a focus. I think there'll be a lot of consultants who will offer, I think, a lot of, kind of harmonizing data, and we'll all sort of hit that sort of minimum standard, which is right. And then there'll be companies who do a little bit more. And I think that's what will happen. This is a, I think what will be more interesting to see, especially if, companies are in verticals that have really been badly hit by this, right? More so than the financial crisis. Then I think those are really going to have, some interesting challenges, which may have a contagion effect, right? So, for example, we know that if you got any sort of bailout, you likely are going to have some executive compensation constraints, right? So you're going to need, if you're on the compensation committee for one of those types of companies, you're really going to need to know what you can and cannot do. very quickly, because those are impacts that hit immediately. I think there's going to be a sort of, a potential, long tail impact for that with, the comp consult, as they're looking across peer groups and things like that. So I anticipate that skill set needing to be really sharpened because of this. I think with mass unemployment like we're seeing, if there isn't a recovery, which, it's hard to see how that happens anytime soon, you are going to need that audit committee focus as well on, risk focus. So my anticipation is we're going to see from a human capital and boards thinking about, those skills more, and having people who know how to navigate through those. Probably people who's what happened in the financial crisis, I think, are going to bring in a lot of that expertise. But it's not going to be enough. It's definitely, we all know on a scale that we haven't seen before. So, just even in the short term, I think the companies that are in verticals that have been hit the worst are certainly going to need says tighten their belts on compensation, and then all of us obviously are going to need to think about that, and then risk management.
Yeah, I think those are huge areas, and you mentioned the importance of government as you think about sort of bailouts and how that's going to impact compensation and other areas. One of the areas I'm curious about is for companies like PayPal and Hitachi operating on a global scale, are there particular areas beyond just the pure financial that you think government and regulators should be looking at coming through this crisis to work more closely with industry, or to play a broader role with industry in sort of addressing what's coming out of this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it sort of gets to the, the sort of the old saying of, never waste a crisis. And I think we say that a lot around PayPal, because I think what this situation has really highlighted is that the kind of coalition need in government and the corporate world is actually already at a very high. We were already talking about this in the World Economic Forum in January about, the need for sort of, capitalism to be sort of co-owned with not just governments, but also with the corporate world. I actually think this pandemic really raises that to another new bar, because what I think it will create an opportunity to do is very much like what we've experienced so far, which is, accelerated fast tracking of solutions with government to be able to help and support customers. And, those of us who have been at this for a while, we've seen that take, sometimes years and years and years to get progress in. And now we're seeing progress in the matter of weeks because the necessity's there. I think if there's a way to keep building that momentum, and you see that now with, sort of opening up apertures on testing, with different companies. And I think, I think we obviously, there's protections that need to be followed, and we need to make sure we're not giving people things that aren't safe, but I think the opportunity for innovation here is enormous, and I think that will actually, you could even argue this pandemic creates a new industrial revolution for technology and government to really, I think, get ahead and jump ahead of some of these barriers that we've all been sort of living with for the last decade or more.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective of how it could force greater engagement across different areas. I'll be curious to see how that develops and how receptive corporate boards are to that kind of back and forth, particularly in some of the sensitive areas that you mentioned. I want to talk about a different aspect of corporate governance that I think is possible to come out of this crisis a little bit, around shareholder activism. And so it's obviously been an important part of corporate governance for some time. PayPal dealt with it. Other companies in Silicon Valley are starting to deal with it more perhaps than they have in the past. Is your view, do you think this will cool off activism a little bit, given that there's a humanitarian aspect here and companies are vulnerable in a way that is different than perhaps just being financially vulnerable, although they're that too? Or is that sort of Pollyannish and activism is going to continue to increase and this provides more opportunity? I've seen sort of differing viewpoints on either side, and but I'm curious for your point of view sitting in the seat that you're in.
Yeah, look, I don't think it changes. I think it creates opportunity too, where I talked about opportunity a moment ago. I think there's a sort of a window here for a lot of companies who are vulnerable, and I think I've heard very firsthand that companies have been approached. It's a shame because I feel like you shouldn't really be exploited in these situations, but this is still a free economy, and capitalism still prevails. So I don't think I can complain about it in that sense, but I don't think it slows down. And I think there will be a lot of distressed companies if the economy doesn't start to will invariably create opportunity, whether it's activism or private equity buying. I think the opportunities are there, and I think every company is thinking about it, and you should, by the way. I think every company should be thinking about it with two lenses, right? One is is there an opportunity for you to have access to companies that maybe were not available to you before, because we've seen such an increase in market capitalization. And then there's the other lens, which is are you you really need to think about how are you going to preempt a situation? Are you really ready for it? I mean, I hope most companies have already been thinking about this just as standard practice in terms of thinking about your vulnerabilities as a company. But I think that will be a risk. People are talking about more poison pills. We've seen some companies introduce them. I think it's going to be really interesting in this proxy season to see how people respond to that. I think there's some tolerance, especially for companies with a 10 billion market cap or below, where there's more vulnerability. But my hope is that it sort of moves on quickly to a sort of a more, and I think this much depends on the stock market, but if you can get economic recovery, then I think we'll just carry on hopefully with the mode we were doing, which was there's just a sort of a constant stream of activism, and and I think that is just the nature of sort of free market economies.
Yeah, I'm with you a little bit on the activism point. I think it's going to be interesting to let it play out. I have one more question, and then just for a heads up to the audience, there's one or two questions in the queue, but please, if you want to raise your hand, then we can move forward to the Q&A session. You've got a unique role, Louise, in that this is the third major world crisis that you've had the opportunity, the pleasure, whatever you want to call it, to be in a leadership position, coming through the dot-com bust, moving through the financial crisis, and now the pandemic. Is there a personal theme that you use in your role to try to handle these situations as an executive, as a board member? And is there a common theme that you can pull through all three at this point that you're seeing, or is still too early with this one?
Look, I think for me personally, I think this one in particular, but even more so as well in the past, I think this sort of empathy and this humanitarian element of leadership is actually elevated. And what I've enjoyed seeing about this situation is everyone feels closer. Like I sit on so many meetings where I can say now to my CEO, can you just talk to this team, and he's suddenly accessible, right? And so now we've created actually an opportunity for inclusion, I think at a level that I've never actually seen before, because now you've got to balance that, right? Because you don't want, we also know the downside to this current situation, which is there's no boundaries between personal and work. But But as a general observation, I would say, I think the sort of the human sort of togetherness that this has created is being quite profound, and I actually don't want to lose that. And I feel that's the opportunity that now sort of sits with me as an executive and as a leader, and as I, how we want to bring. We've created something unintentionally quite magical with the way we work right now, and we've got to, I think, find the way to keep that, and and then obviously to bring people safely back to work. So I think in terms of themes through what I've experienced, this is probably the strongest sort of empathetic leadership moment that I think most of us will endure in our careers.
Yeah, I think, and really appreciate you taking the time to share your perspective. So we have a question in the queue. Peter's question: the way society is evolving and the awareness of accountability together with the tools and digital knowledge that's being developed, in the future, will we still be needing boards?
That's a great question. Look, I do think we need boards. I think there's going to be no substitute for the expertise and the accountability and oversight that boards create. And I do think it will change the way the boards engage going forward. And I do think it potentially changes the demographic of boards, especially with the I would say the broad advent of technology that this has created. And I think the understanding of technology will require a different potential skill set in the future. But I don't see a world that this is created where boards are not needed. And in fact, I'd argue that they potentially have a bigger role in ensuring that companies are really driving, I think, the risk, the accountability around taking care of your employees, and I think ensuring that sort of are core ingredients to your market cap, your shareholder value. I think those responsibilities actually only increase, in my opinion, for board members.
That's great. We have a couple questions from Luca.
Yes, thank you. It was fascinating to listen to the two of you. I have two questions, and they draw on some other questions that have been made throughout the day and possibly have not been answered. So one of the attendees at some point asked, you're saying that a lot will change after the pandemic, but how? So no one can answer that question, of course, when no one knows what the new normal will be. But my curiosity is about whether a large tech company like PayPal is trying to make sense or figure out how consumer behavior can change, and whether it is planning for various scenarios and so on. So whether you are trying to anticipate what is absolutely unpredictable, in other words, but possibly something that an entrepreneurial company has to do also possibly in normal times. The other question is about PayPal as corporate venture capital. I think you are a big player in corporate venture capital, and I was wondering how that part of your business is dealing with this situation. We heard this morning about how in Israel the VC financing has frozen. The venture capitalists are getting rid of the bad companies in the portfolio and forcing the good ones to lay off people, which doesn't sound great, even though perhaps we tend to be less sympathetic with startup, hyper dynamic entrepreneurial kinds of people, but still there are people there who may lose, who will lose jobs, etc. I was wondering whether PayPal does things differently or anyhow has a story to tell about this.
Yeah, so let me take your first question about what changes. And look, you're right, none of us have a crystal ball. In digital e-commerce, I think we see those tidal shifts already starting to happen around how people's behaviors are going to shift, and the way they engage in commerce. And I think that, like I said before, is opportunistic. I think in the workforce, I think what we'll see is a couple of, I think we'll all have to give up some privacy in the interests of safety, right? Safety in the workforce becomes a paramount to privacy. And what do I mean by that? I mean, look, I think it will become more normal than not that temperature screening when you come to an office, because if I'm coming to the office, I want to know that everybody else around me is healthy, and that I'm not going to get sick from them. And I think those types of shifts are going to happen, and every blue chip company is talking about that right now. Well, that means then in all likelihood you've got to give up privacy data. Like companies will only be able to keep that sort of data for a limited period of time, but I think that's what's going to start to happen. And I think I think we're never really going to be comfortable sitting in small cubes where we are an arm's length from somebody else. I think that is going to shift, and I think the way we office, the way we the way we operate in in everyday environments, we are going to be much more social distancing. Thing that I think will stay with us at least until you get good vaccination programs in place at scale, right? And people are predicting that could be 12-18 months away. So I think in terms of how we operate in everyday life, I do think we can predict with pretty good certainty that those things are here to stay. In terms of your question around corporate venture, corporate capital, yes, that is part of our business. We do strategic corporate venture investment, and typically that is done, I think, in alignment with of interest of or sort of where we really want to explore. So we haven't we have not done the activity that you just described that you're seeing in different parts of the world. We're not sort of forcing layoffs or anything like that at this point. And our CEO came out quite publicly and said we wouldn't be doing any COVID-19 related layoffs. So that isn't something that we're seeing or experiencing firsthand.
Other questions?
Mike, it's Ron Gilson. Can you hear me?
Hey, Ron.
I have a couple of questions, if nobody minds.
Please.
Fire away.
One is looking backwards, one is looking forwards. There's a tendency, I've heard of people who describe what we're going through now. It was just another one of those black swans, and how can you anticipate them? I think the most in reality, to start my video, okay. How I can do that. Look at that. What becomes pretty clear, I mean, even if we date it from a combination of SARS and the Gates Foundation memo in 2015, my guess is pretty much no significant company paid any attention to it. Now we're going to pay more attention to it now, but as I think about it in risk management terms, other than it having happened, we didn't learn anything more. We learned more about what we can do, but we didn't learn anything more about the probability of it happening between 2015 and now, or the probability of it happening in the future. Now, I understand how things actually happening has a way of grabbing people's attention, but that's what we're supposed to be avoiding in a risk management function. And I guess I'm wondering, looking back, was there a moment when somebody said, oh, what about this? And then we just swept it under the rug, or it never came to anybody's attention? Because I mean, we're making the same claim about pretty much every government in the world as well. And there was an awful lot of information. What happened inside of PayPal? Did it ever come up?
So in terms of the situation we're in, no, it didn't come up. Have we been spending significant times anticipating fail-safe type plans? Yes. And that's what I referred to earlier, like if a country went down or if several countries went down, did we ever anticipate that the whole world would go down at the same time? No, absolutely not. And I'm not sure it would have been taken particularly credibly if we had done that. And I think it was so hard to imagine. And and even I think people like Bill Gates would say that they didn't really anticipate when. And so I think companies have to be somewhat pragmatic and deal with what they can know. And I think at that time most companies anticipated situations where for the political unrest, or whether it was cyber attacks or anything like that, where countries could go down. And now we have to anticipate that this could happen again, and we need to be ready for it. What I've been pleasantly surprised with, though, is how companies have been able to keep moving through this, and that's a sort of a variety of companies. I'm not just talking about tech companies, but the medical companies, the manufacturing companies have been able to sort of institute practices very, very quickly that keep their employees safe, but allow them to continue doing, their essential work. So, from that lens, I'm sure we'll speculate between now and forever that, could somebody have anticipated it? Yes. Would it have been taken particularly credibly at that time in terms of, really, really planning a full playbook that anticipated that scenario? I don't think so. I really don't.
It's interesting because the Nobel Prize winner who will have contributed to your last statement is Danny Kahneman, because we know that we underestimate low probability, big damage events. And there was the reason why I'm thinking in the company I'm involved in, what do I want to do differently with respect to risk management than I have in the past? And that leads to the second question, and then I'll get out of everybody's way. You can move pretty much everybody at home, particularly if you've got say 1,400 employees. They know each other, low turnover, Midwestern company. And without losing the sense of knowledge of your teammates' skills, who you can trust and who you can't. Mike, the question I have, because it puzzles me, is as workforce turns over and you begin to lose that, if you will, that body of trust and knowledge that's built up over time, at that point, managing at a distance seems to me to become a lot harder. And I'm not sure I have any sense about how one would go about sort of replenishing the human capital investment between employees that lets you pull that off.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it's definitely something that, you know, I don't see the world sort of going entirely work from home everywhere. We certainly don't anticipate that in PayPal. I think there will be, you know, a very great need for, you know, human connectivity in the workplace. I don't ever see that dissipating. I do think that there will be more flexibility, and I think you'll have, you know, where it was sort of almost a privilege for employees to work from home previously. I think you'll have more opportunity for employees to stay, you know, kind of, you know, vote with their feet more. But, you know, I think the point you're making around, you know, that sort of, you know, that knowledge, that sort of, you know, co-creation, that that sort of, you know, environment where, you know, you can't recreate that over video conferencing entirely. It's still, I mean, I think we'll evolve back to that to some extent, but you know, I think right now, you know, I think what companies are seeing is actually the opposite, right? A lack of attrition, right? So we all anticipate in our business models a certain amount of attrition. Nobody's leaving right now into their roles, but that will shift. No one can bank on that. And then I think there'll be a greater dependency on, you know, process information, right? So, you know, where you may have information about an employee or a project on your computer, or, you know, even in your notebook, I think there'll be a greater dependency on tools for those types of collaborations. And I think it will force people to sort of use those tools where they've been somewhat optional today. So I think the point you're making actually, I think, brings up a sort of a new technology sort of opportunity. And at the same time, I think, you know, it still, you know, I think highlights the need for that sort of human interaction, which I don't think you can ever truly substitute.
Interesting. As you were thinking, I was trying to imagine a company in this environment that didn't already have it, trying to shift into an agile decision-making process, but without that ahead of time.
Yeah, you know, people have struggled, right? There's no question. And I've watched people struggle with this. But, you know, it's a little bit like, you know, I mean, I have a 7-year-old daughter. I'm also homeschooling at the same time as I have a full-time job, right? And, you know, if you had said to me at the beginning of March, that I would have to be homeschooling my child and doing my job entirely from home, I would have thought you were absolutely crazy. And yet, you know, in the first 2 weeks, you know, I wanted to cry a lot because the school schedules and everything else were horrific, and I didn't think it was possible. And now, you know, we're 4 weeks into it, and it's like, okay, this is doable. It's like anything, you know, it's sort of Darwin's theory of evolution. I think we will evolve. And that's what I've seen. We've all sort of cried a little bit and we've struggled, and now we're sort of coming through it. And I think it builds a resilience. And so companies like you've described, you know, who have definitely, I think, struggled with that sort of, you know, immediacy. I mean, we just for example, it's not like we suddenly had this sort of, you know, huge amount of laptops we could just give everybody. We were letting people take home their desktops, right? We were literally letting you come in and remove your desktop. That's how we got our people working from home. And it's not ideal, right? And that's not sustainable, but we let you do that. And I think companies have had to just get insanely creative to accommodate what is a really extreme situation.
Interesting.
We have one question in the queue. Maya is curious about whether PayPal is considering getting into the void in terms of being able to do small and medium-sized enterprise loans, whether there's a gap there that can be filled by PayPal.
Yes, so well, we do already offer financing for small and medium-sized businesses. We do that through our partnership with Synchrony. So PayPal isn't a bank, and so we already do offer merchant capital and consumer credit offerings. Through this SBA program, we've actually, been able to stand up through our partner web bank, lending to our merchants who've been able to leverage that program at pretty extraordinary scale. I think the sort of the current challenges, I think the government funding for that is actually already been fully utilized. And so now we're waiting to find out if there's going to be more funding for that. So look, our merchants and our small businesses, as well as our big merchants are, who we're here to serve in so many ways. And I think that's such an important constituent for us. And that, and also the giving platform that we have around community giving. Last PayPal's giving platform raised $10 billion, and so we have the opportunity to PayPal for small giving gifts as well, and we're finding that that's being well utilized in this crisis as well.
In the queue about the trade-off. I think I've been muted.
You were muted, Mike. I can hear you now.
I'm back now.
Yeah.
Okay, great. A trade-off of privacy with big banks and not exchanging smooth enough service. And is there an opportunity for a company like PayPal, this is Peter's question, to be between two business partners and eliminate lengthy bank procedures and come to be into a financial arrangement that way?
Yeah, look, I mean, again, as I said, we're not a bank ourselves, and we do partner with, banks and with the networks. So I think what we try to do is create solutions that, make it a bit more ubiquitous and easy to sort of, move your money around. And so, I think there's a role for all of us to play, and I think we're definitely looking at the current situation as much from the angle of how does this change human behaviors going forward, right? I do think that if you go into a grocery store right now in the United States, it's in all likelihood the card machines are covered in plastic, right? People don't want to exchange cash. So we know these behavioral shifts are going to happen. We're definitely seeing that people are doing much more online shopping. And I think that's where a company like PayPal can, I think, support commerce and support merchants directly and getting sort of faster customer adoption. And I think that's really where we offer, I think, great opportunity.
That's great. I want to thank Louise for joining us, and thanks all of you for the questions. And we'll wrap up this session, and I'd like to hand this over to Professor Jonathan Macy from Yale. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name's John Macy. I'm live here from New Haven, Connecticut. I have a couple of slides, which I will show if I can get them to appear, which is never a certainty. Hold on. Anyway, my talk is going to be about insider trading and the COVID-19 crisis. And I want to begin by talking about insider trading by public officials. Then I want to talk about the theory of the paper. And then I want to talk about insider trading in the private sector, by corporate insiders and hedge fund people and the like, and then finish with a couple of policy recommendations. So I don't know if people can see. Luca, can people see this slide? I don't know if they can or not.
Yes, they can.
Oh, good. Okay. So basically what we have here are pictures of two U.S. senators, Richard Burr a Republican from North Carolina, and Kelly Loeffler, a Republican from Georgia. And both of them were among a group of senators who, following who on January 24th, 2020, received from public health officials a private briefing that was given to the Senate Health Committee to update the senators on the coronavirus, and this was given to the Senate Health Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. Following this, there was a rash of insider trading. I won't talk about all of the senators who engaged in insider trading, although there are a large number. I just want to focus on these two because the evidence is so clear with respect to what these folks did. So what these folks did, in essence, was sell. And so, for example, we have, I'll start with Kelly. Kelly is from my home state of Georgia, and she's married to a guy named Jeff Sprecher, who happens to be the chairman of ICE, the Intercontinental Stock Exchange, which is headquartered in Atlanta, but owns the New York Stock Exchange, where Jeff is the chief executive officer. And these power couple, if you will, dumped a tremendous amount of stock, about $6 million in mutual fund shares and maybe as much as $20 million in shares in the Intercontinental Stock Exchange. So a lot of insider trading. And here's kind of the funny part. After the trading occurred, there was a huge public outcry. Now, while this outcry comes, of course, Loeffler's already sold. The stock market plummets to its lowest amount, and she says in an editorial in the Wall Street Journal, mea culpa, shouldn't have done it, and she buys in at the low point, which for some reason that I can't fathom, nobody seems to think is an additional felony. But anyway, she seems to think she's, but you know, obviously, as everyone on this call knows, you can make as much money by selling high and buying low as you can by buying low and selling high. A separate story, and there's no evidence that any government agency is investigating Loeffler. I'll get to the law on this in just a second, but let me talk a bit about Senator Burr from Republican of North Carolina. The reason he is so much in the spotlight is people think he's the most likely person for the government to sue if, in the unlikely event, the SEC pulls its head out of a hole and decides to actually enforce the law, which I think is highly unlikely. What he did was he sold a bunch of stock immediately after the briefing, and he told his constituents and the public that I didn't get any negative information at this meeting, and there's no reason to think that I was motivated to sell by what I learned at this meeting. But at the same time, he was speaking to a group of high donors to his political campaign, and a group called the Tar Heel Circle. North Carolina is where this guy comes from, is the Tar Heel state. And he said to this private group, as opposed to what he was telling the public, well, you know, this is, quote, a much more aggressive in its transmission than anything we've seen in recent history, and compares it unfavorably to the 1918 flu epidemic. So clearly when the guy's talking to the people with money, with his own money, he's selling, and to everybody else he's saying, oh, I just, you know, normal turnover of my portfolio over the life cycle, which is demonstrably false. So the SEC didn't do anything except there was a big outcry after Loeffler. They published a blog post, the two co-directors of enforcement of the SEC, and they said, we are really concerned about insider trading. We're not going to maybe do anything about what you've been reading about, but we just want to know we care, sort of. So this trading activity appears to be clearly illegal. Under the Obama administration, there was passed the Stock Act, the Stop Trading on Congressional Knowledge Act, which specifies that members of Congress, which includes members of the House and members of the Senate, of course, owe a duty arising from a relation of trust and confidence owed to Congress, the United States government, and the citizens of the United States with respect to material non-public information. So these people argue we didn't have any material non-public information. We're just really smart. So what I want to go on to say is this should be, from a theory perspective, extremely unsurprising, in that everything we know about the theory of insider trading suggests that the COVID virus will be an absolute, pardon the expression, petri dish or fermenting ground for insider trading. And here's the reason in the literature. Number one, it's like a takeover. You have a discrete event, or in this case, a ton of discrete events that is characterized by asymmetry of information. People know about this in small numbers, and before the information is widely disseminated, there's a trading window. So what we have, in the words of a prosecution, is the classic prosecutor's idea of we have motive and we have opportunity. The COVID-19 crisis presents opportunity. Then we have this other two features embedded in this, implicit in what I just said, subsequent release of information. So the information is expected to have a big price impact. So we have motive and opportunity, and we have the kind of classic, if you will, three conditions for there being insider trading. In addition, I think what's also affected, there's a couple of specific things about the COVID-19 virus. We have a social and economic climate where people are highly distracted. They're worried about epidemiology, not insider trading, perhaps. So people seem to think maybe they can go a little bit below the radar, if you will. And, unlike the crisis in what's known, I guess, in some circles as the Lehman Brothers crisis, or if we say in the US, the crisis of 07, 08, the crisis hit Wall Street and Main Street at the same time. It didn't migrate to Wall Street from Main Street or from Silicon Valley like the dot-com bubble, or from Wall Street to Main Street like the 07, 08 financial crisis. So it's a little bit simultaneously. So another way of thinking about this is we can kind of modify, if you will, on the basis of what we've learned in the COVID and also M&A, the classic Peltzman equation that the amount of crime will be the severity of the punishment times the risk of being caught. We have to also include in the equation the supply of insider trading opportunities in an economy. And this is what, to use a military vernacular, we would say is a target-rich environment where epidemiology and public health rules and quarantining rules and particular effect on specific companies, information is being generated at a rapid, very, very rapid rate. This is a slide I just saw today in the Said Business School Oxford presentation by Renee Adams. She basically is showing in this slide the fabulous data source, and I'm extremely grateful and claim no ownership of this data, only that I'm marveling at it, and it's adding a new dimension to my paper, and I want to give her full credit. But basically, the punchline is the graph on the far right, which is we see a tremendous amount of insider trading by officers and directors. Based on what I've said before, hopefully it's not so surprising. What is really interesting is that this is not stock market sales. Her data shows that there isn't any evidence of unusual sales by officers and directors. This is insiders' purchases showing confidence in the market, or as Renee and Bailouts say in their recent paper, officers and directors are signaling confidence. Now, leaving her great data and moving on to my more tendentious theorizing. My takeaway from this, which I don't want to blame Renee or her co-author for, is this seems to me that this is a good thing, that this is showing optimism. Maybe we don't like insider trading in general. Do we really hate it in this context? I would say maybe not. So to kind of wrap up just a little bit, basically, I would think that we should, based on how well the current rulemaking infrastructure is working, I would essentially say, look, there should be a rule of outlawing trading at all in pandemics by elected officials. I also think that government bailouts, now this slide doesn't exactly capture my policy suggestion, I apologize. What I'm trying to say about government bailouts is I think that we should encourage officers and directors to do what they're doing, which is purchasing stock. But I think we should discourage officers and directors from doing what politicians are doing, which is selling stock. So I think that if we should have no government bailouts at all, where you have insiders and directors selling their shares, and this would, in my view, highlight the basic point that there's a fiduciary duty owed to shareholders, and that you compromise this fiduciary duty if you engage in selling on the basis of material, non-public, bad information about your firm. How much time do I have left, Luca?
5 minutes.
Great. All right. So I just want to have one more slide. I just want to briefly talk about U.S. law a little bit, and to tell the academics in the room what the rules are that apply to us, at least for trading in U.S. equities on the basis of material, non-public information about the public health or epidemiology or earnings associated with firms. So the U.S. law on trading on public health information is extremely well developed. There's a 2017 Second Circuit, that's New York, Court of Appeals opinion, which deals with insider trading on a drug colloquially known as BAPI that was designed to slow the onset of Alzheimer's disease. And a hedge fund operator, Mr. Martoma, had developed a relationship with the doctor at the University of Michigan who led the FDA study on this drug, and some initial data came back that was extremely promising for this drug, and lots of medical schools such as UPenn were leading clinical trials on this. Then the Michigan guy gathers up all the data. He's going to present it at a giant conference on this drug that is sponsored by the pharmaceutical company. And in a conversation with this hedge fund analyst, Martoma, who incidentally works for Stephen Cohen's SAC Capital at the time, he said, you know, you look at all this data, you put it all together, and even though, interestingly, even though the data was in the public sector, he was the first one to kind of synthesize it and collate it and reach a global conclusion. He says, this thing doesn't work so well. And so on the basis of that information, SAC Capital liquidated their very large share of stock in the pharmaceutical company, Wyeth, that was developing the drug, and sold a boatload, bought a boatload of put options. And so the question is, would there be liability here? There are two basic issues from a legal perspective under insider trading law. The first issue is, did this guy Martoma have any, did the tipper, in this case, the doctor, have any fiduciary duty not to trade on the basis of this inside information that he had developed? Did he owe any duty? And the court easily found a duty, and he said, look, this guy was under contract with the Food and Drug Administration. If you read the guy's contract, it said no insider trading can be done on the basis of information obtained during this clinical research. So that raises the question, of course, to me, well, what if you work at Stanford or Columbia and you don't have an FDA grant, you're just operating in your normal course of your research activities, and you come up with material inside information? I believe what US law says is that you, in order to find out whether you have a duty not to disclose, to abstain from trading, you have to look at your employment contract. You look at the handbook, the faculty handbook, and other documents that make up the contract. Unfortunately, for me personally, Yale, where I work, has a pretty strict faculty code of conduct. So if I want to engage in insider trading, I'm going to have to read some faculty handbooks of other universities and see where my contractual ability might be a little bit broader. Just kidding, I don't really plan to trade on this. The second thing is the other big litigated issue in insider trading in this context of epidemiological information, public health sort of stuff, is the hedge fund person who's obtaining the information must supply a personal benefit to the person who's tipping him. But the courts, I won't waste any more time other than to say, the courts have been extremely broad in a series of cases in the Ninth Circuit and the Supreme Court and in the Second Circuit in defining the personal benefit test. It could be anything that would be consideration in a contract, or it would be anything that might be considered a gift, even if there's no what we would say in US contract law would be consideration. So the critical issue going forward with respect to these prosecutions is going to be materiality of the information, had it already been incorporated in share prices, and this issue of, is the person under a fiduciary or contractual obligation not to trade? I'll end just by saying I take great comfort and hope in the fact that politicians are selling and real corporate insiders are buying. It shows that, given my view and opinion of politicians and my much higher view of officers and directors, and their much greater success in engaging in trading on the basis of material non-public information, it may be that we might get out of this sooner than many of us fear. Thank you so much, Luca, and ECGI for letting me talk.
Thank you very much, John. It's now Mariana Parglende's turn to discuss John's paper. Mariana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca and ECGI for the invitation. I'm here speaking from São Paulo, Brazil. It's a great honor to discuss Professor John Macy's paper. As he knows well, he was my teacher, not my corporate law teacher, so he cannot be blamed for my comments, but it's really a great honor and privilege to take part in this discussion. So we are all facing the question about what is happening in corporate law and the world as it relates to COVID, and how is the COVID world different from the pre-COVID world. And especially we're facing the question about whether our legal institutions are up to the task. Professor Macy makes the point that the coronavirus crisis is especially conducive to insider trading, and that's what seems to be appearing in news throughout. And his analysis suggests that current legal institutions might not be up to the task. So he does propose a few possible reforms to deal with this problem. So one reason that Professor Macy suggests is that the SEC is dependent on congressional funding. So that might be the reason for the SEC's shy approach to the existing scandals regarding senators, in which it issued a statement but launched no investigation. I wonder if, in addition to this particular factor, the current political environment and especially the partisan affiliation of the senators involved might have played a role. And I wonder whether Professor Macy has hope that prosecutors might engage in enforcement against those against those politicians, either based on insider trading or on other federal criminal grounds. With respect to the proposal, and here I build on Professor Macy's final comment about his different faith in politicians and directors and officers. In terms of the proposals, it really struck me the different types of treatment. On the one hand, the proposal is that elected officials be banned from trading during a pandemic. On the other hand, there is an implicit encouragement in purchases but not sales by directors and officers. So I wonder if there would be different implications had the officials bought stock rather than sold stock. That doesn't appear to be the case, but in any case, I was struck by the differential treatment proposed, since the purchases by directors and officers was viewed in positive light, and the sales by officials in a negative light. With respect to the corporate bailout proposal in particular, that would be for me some source of concern. I understand the incentive effects that Professor Macy seems to attain with this proposal in terms of building confidence. Of course, confidence is good, but informational efficiency is also good. But even beyond that, the concern is that what if that does not work and they sell nonetheless? Of course, the potential victims of these measures in terms of denial of corporate bailouts, should they be forthcoming otherwise, would fall on shareholders as well as employees. So given, I mean, either a shareholder-centric or a more institutional conception of the corporation, whether it makes sense at all to punish other parties for the deeds of directors and officers, which are agents and might not be completely faithful agents. Instead, they might look for their own interest instead. Also, I thought the proposals were interesting in being cabined in terms of the ban on trade proposal to the pandemic scenario. I think one of the things we are facing now is do we need broader reforms, or do we need reforms that are tailored to the present circumstances? And I think there are advantages in that narrow focus, especially in terms of the experiment that allows us to run. However, of course, we were then focusing on the current crisis, but this crisis is unlikely to be the only historical opportunity for insider trading. So what do we have? I hope not, but other types of disasters forthcoming, such as wars and so on. Would you want to have broader rules for exceptional circumstances or not? And even beyond that, and that goes back to how we should think about insider trading in terms of politicians or government officials compared to traditional corporate insiders. And then I would love to hear your views about existing proposals that would lead to greater convergence of both regimes instead of divergence. So what I have in mind here is, say, a recent paper by Gregory Schill that suggests that because inside information is so pervasive, of course, in the federal government, and that has been acknowledged at least since Henry Maine, maybe we need a system that deals with that more consistently. So he has in mind specific 12b51 plans or Section 16E exemptions thereafter. So I wonder how you would react to those proposals, and even more broadly, because I think in this particular context of insider trading by government officials, there are, of course, two types of potential concerns. One is a type of concern about investor protection and information asymmetry, or even a perception of fairness in stock markets. Of course, you have in this context, especially when in a pandemic, but more generally regarding officials' actions, you also have a concern about where their loyalty lies and where their
There is a problem with Mariana's connection.
And whether it would favor some greater as officials. So I think Gregory Shaw will have.
I am afraid we have a problem with Mariana's connection. I would suggest...
Point, and which is that during my time as a graduate student at Yale, I had the great privilege of hearing a presentation of an earlier paper by Professor Macy about whistleblowing and insider trading, where he advanced a highly nuanced view about the treatment of insider trading, suggesting that in some circumstances, insider trading has the same or even greater benefits than whistleblowing, and in fact can be a credible way to bring true and valuable information to light. And in that respect, I wonder whether Professor Macy would like to treat all types of trading by government officials in the same manner. So what if, in fact, top officials are obscuring, complete hypothetical, okay? So what if top officials are obscuring the truth from the population for political purposes? Would then trading by either congressional members or even their staff, should it be subject to different treatment in a way that could be analogous to trading by whistleblowers that Professor Macy defended in earlier work? So thank you, Luca. It's such a great privilege to see you both and take part in this discussion.
I don't know whether now it's Marco's time to take over as a chair.
Sure.
Yeah, so
Pleasure.
Yeah.
So I think, well, we are now running into the final lap of this marathon. So I've been asked to chair this final lap. So I think we should start by collecting some further questions for Jonathan. We certainly have one online from Monomita Nandi. So you're being asked, Jonathan, do you suggest any change in existing firm level corporate governance that can mitigate the risk associated with insider trading?
Yes, I think that's a terrific question, Marco. My current thinking on the subject is I don't have a problem with current governance. My problem, and this also gets to one of Mariana's excellent points, is the laws we have on the books are enough. And the corporate governance structures we have are enough. What we don't have is apparently the political will to enforce the laws that we have on the books. So I don't think we would need a change in corporate governance. Maybe a change in the kind of incentive structure of shareholders to bring private rights of action in the face of basically a situation where, in my view, what we observe is the people who are supposed to enforce these rules, the organized stock exchanges, the SEC, the Department of Justice, for various kind of structural reasons that Mariana alluded to some in her talk, we're just not getting enforcement. So that kind of bottom line, that's the problem.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Do we have any other questions on the insider trading, or do you
I'd
want
love
to
it if there are more
respond?
questions. If not, I would spend a minute or two responding specifically to Mariana. But if there are questions from the audience, that's great too, Marco.
I don't have any other questions from the attendees here at the moment. So then for the final lap, so I think we can then conclude the discussion of insider trading and move to the final lap, which is going to consist of 3 parts. The first part is that Ron Gilson is going to say a few words and share some thoughts. Then I'll do a sort of mini summing up to frame a discussion. We have a little discussion if possible. And then Luca is going to say a few words, and then we're going to finish where we started in Australia with Jennifer Hill, and that'll be the end on the 24-hour marathon that Luca invented. So I'll turn the floor to Ron Gilson if he's still there. Ron.
I can't start the video because the host has stopped it. Here it is. There I am.
There you are.
Look at that. There has been, I mean, over the course of the entire program, there's been an enormous amount of information about how the at least unplanned for pandemic just works its way through operating businesses of every size and in every way, and the breadth of the discussion today along those lines has really just been terrific. I want to do something different, but just because it's the end and everybody will be too tired to object, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the specific impact of the pandemic on a tension that's been running through corporate governance, at least from the beginning of the 80s. And that is a tension between, on the one hand, letting companies make use of the increasingly complete capital markets in order to generate more, better returns for shareholders on the one hand, and on the other, the sense that the range of groups that the corporation ought to be concerned about is much broader than that. And we can label it different ways. It can be stakeholders. It can be what stands behind Colin's corporate purpose. It can be Marty Lipton's new paradigm. But the tension back and forth between what I would characterize as, on the one hand, corporate governance, which is using the capital market completion, the development of junk bonds, the development of hostile takeovers, the development of activist positions, as we saw equity intermediation, on the one hand, and this broader concern, not so much about corporate governance, in my view, but about real governance. Because in the end, the corporation is what I think of as a screwdriver. It's a tool. Screwdrivers, I learned, were invented in the mid-17th century. The only thing it was used for was for making weapons, and that stayed the same until somebody invented the Phillips screw. When it became much more useful. But the notion that the corporation could be used by the government as an instrument of government policy comes as no surprise, and the list of examples is enormous. We've seen it in the political arena, certainly most recently, Liz Warren's proposed litigation in the United States, Corbyn's proposed legislation before the UK before the UK election. In each case, using governance as a lever to do something which is associated with using the company for a broader range of outcomes. What strikes me about the current, the impact of the current pandemic, at this stage, and looking ahead, in terms of where it might go, strikes me as shifting the emphasis within governance discussion as it's been since the 70s to focus more emphatically on the interaction between real governance and corporate governance, where we see different national systems evolving into having different and having a different role in which government uses corporations for a policy purpose. Now, here's what to be honest, here's what triggered that link for me between corporate governance, real governance, and the pandemic. What is apparent from one of the nice responses in the prior panel, that is near as a really sophisticated general counsel understood, despite having all of the information that the real government had, and the threat of this event, of this kind of event going forward, was not a black swan. Nobody paid any attention to it. The government side of it is simply the same. It's the same lead-in. Nobody did anything about it. As I think about the US government's response, what comes to mind is, with respect to the efficient running of hospitals, forget the way it gets paid for and all of that for a moment. Hospitals do an astonishingly efficient job of running their business. They don't have excess capacity. They're really good at making sure their supply chain comes out of places where it's done the cheapest. And lo and behold, when this thing hit, we basically lacked the government capacity to do anything about it. The private sector wasn't going to do anything because we created a system where they're running their business really efficiently, and it's not their job to provide excess capacity for a public good. It's the government's job to do that. And if we could partner the two, it might make some useful sense. The puzzle I have is the extent to which our experience over this period, not so much that it affected corporate governance, that it was too long-term or too short-term, or any of the empty slogans we all throw around, but rather it so sufficiently shrunk the role of real governance and the capacity and intelligence of real governance that it simply could not provide the excess capacity that the private system was not designed to provide. This brings me to the concern that I have, which is an increased use of the government by the government of playing with corporate governance in order to meet this concern, rather than recognizing that private businesses are not going to be good at internalizing the potential of enormous externalities. That really is the role of the government. And we're going to get nowhere with having a government that we have much confidence in being able to respond to what we're seeing. Having said that, I'm not sure I have anything of real value to suggest about it. By and large, it seems to me that given the set of issues that the market situation that companies found themselves in, running their own businesses really efficiently, running supply chains in the areas where it generated the best response for that company. Makes perfect sense. It's what we do when we recognize that, maybe the phrase I used before, that there are gray swans out there. They are, when viewed rationally, material enough that we ought to worry about them. But assuming governance gets filtered through a Tversky and Kahneman prison, we're going to get underinvestment in those circumstances, and we're going to find ourselves in this kind of a circumstance, if not for this, repeatedly. So I guess where all this pushes me toward, as a way of sort of summing up the if you will, sort of the political economy of this, is that it's not about, in the end, it's not about corporate governance. It's not about whether directors can have a business model that makes them think that paying employees enough that they want to keep their job, sort of a labor, sort of a standard labor economics move since Stiglitz. Not whether we're doing that well, but what in the world how in the world do we begin thinking less about corporate governance and more about how real governance fits with corporate governance in order to make sure we've got both of these circumstances dealt with. I've seen companies in the last month, over 2 weeks, move 1,400 employees to working remotely. It moved really quickly. San Francisco has done extraordinarily well along some dimensions, but it has no testing. That's a real governance, not a corporate governance problem. And to the extent that there's any kind of silver is the wrong word, lining associated with this experience, it highlights where the intersection of corporate governance and real governance just isn't working. And we see other systems with a balance shifted more toward the government than others, but still no particular thinking, because let's face it, it may not have been a great academic career move over the last 20 years to have an agenda that says, let's make the government work better and more focused in its interaction. That's where it seems to me the money is on going forward. And I'd be delighted to be persuaded that I've got it wrong, because I think this one's really, really hard to make work.
Okay, so let me try and frame or wrap what you just said, Ron, into a sort of general overview of what I heard during the day. And I have to confess that I only started in Israel. So I joined the 24 hours in Israel. So I didn't run the full marathon, but only sort of like a 2/3 of a marathon. So the kind of themes, or the three big themes that I heard coming out, from Israel onwards, was, first of all, what's the role of the private sector? What's the role of the corporations themselves? And then in particular, what's the role of the owners? And I think we heard quite different views. I think we heard quite an optimistic view from Sweden, although we heard some real difficulties there from the trenches, so to speak, about the difficult trade-offs that have to be made. We heard quite a pessimistic view from the UK. I think we heard the view that institutional investors are not willing to provide sufficient amounts of capital. We even heard one call that their rights should be significantly weakened so that they would, for example, have their rights on controlling rights issues waived. So intervention in that dimension. So, and then on the other hand, quite a lot of optimism about corporate purpose and stakeholders, and that companies that have a more stakeholder orientation would do better, etc. Then we had the second big theme, which is government intervention. And that really came in two big themes. I thought the first one was coercion, so the government forcing people to do certain things. And then the second one, and that was, I thought the bigger theme was the government helping in some form. And it was interesting to contrast, and as I said, I didn't hear Asia, and maybe there the story is different, but certainly in Europe, it was about, how can we get governments not to help individually, but as a group? And then secondly, in what form? And in particular, in Frankfurt, I was quite struck by the proposal that governments should help in the form of equity injections, which is a kind of solution to a debt overhang problem. And then, of course, immediately the question arose, what kind of equity? Should that be with voting rights, without voting rights, etc. Whereas in the US, I thought the discussion we just had before was really much more about the aid programs that you've put in place, and also about bankruptcy. And then, of course, there was the discussion with Jack Coffey and Luigi Zingales agreeing that it shouldn't be the banks, but it should be some other kind of intermediary, whether it's the RS or somebody, or the Social Security, to actually give out the money, and in particular targeted at small firms. So that, of course, also has governance implications. Now, the third theme, and probably in practical, immediate terms, the most important, was the question of what's the best exit strategy. Because I think most people I heard agreed that we cannot go on forever having lots of small businesses and the whole service sector having zero income. And I was in particular struck in in Sweden. The Stockholm School had secured the participation of the CEO of one of Sweden's largest wholesale food companies, who specialize in supplying products to restaurants, and basically their clients are going bankrupt, and it's not sure whether they'll ever return. So what do you do in these situations? And it turns a bit back to the beginning. Do you then support these restaurants with money, but who's going to pay the rent? If the rent is not forthcoming, who's going to replace the income of these people? And then it turned back to something that Luigi said, in ultimately the overarching question is, who's going to pay for all of this? And there is going to be some redistribution, and it's intergenerational, it's between different people, between different countries, and so forth. So those were the kind of big themes that I heard, and I'd like to invite you to maybe ask a few questions or have some comments around those three themes. So you can pick any one of them, and if you could just raise a hand, for example. Maybe Ron, you can start.
Sure. The three themes, well, two out of the three things resonate powerfully for me, because with the exception of the fine tuning, they deal directly with the government stepping in to deal with a problem that the private sector is ill-suited to address, not because of its failure, but because of what it's good at. The third, the middle one, which you picked up in the Israeli portion, is the notion that there actually is, that these kinds of issues can be addressed by elements of corporate governance, in particular ownership and the like. I'm not persuaded. I'm frankly not persuaded of that. I'm not persuaded that that the having watched the mutual fund industry for years, the notion that a relatively small number of very large institutional investors are going to be persuaded to do a very good job at what we imagine stewardship could be. You get however much stewardship you get for 1 basis point, and if one compares, for example, at BlackRock, roughly the same day that they announced that they were hiring 90 new people to work in the stewardship group, they fired 90 active portfolio managers. My guess is you could make electricity out of the difference in the difference of the annual compensation of those two groups. So that could the first group understand compensation plans and tell us whether we think they work well or they don't work? Sure, but that doesn't seem to me the problem. If we want stewards who can be inside their business well enough that they are in effect acting like active portfolio managers, but in a direct relationship. That strikes me as unlikely, it seems to me at best. But then the third point, which I thought that you made, is really important because I don't begin to have an answer. For reasons having nothing to do with corporate governance, we have a concentration of ownership, in my mind, largely due to the aging of the population, the need to fund retirement. How you deal with that is a problem, and take the next lane up, and then I'll stop. I keep thinking this is just about, for the lawyers in the room, this is about the rule against perpetuities. You're basically building ownership of land in the UK in the 17th century among a small group of families, and you care locking up the most important productive assets in the country among a small group of people forever. And the same lack of diversity in viewpoint if we're locking up voting control in a relatively small group of investors who can make money with a management fee of 0. Having said that, I don't have much of an idea about how to solve the governance problem associated with it, where there's a diversity of points of view about how a company ought to be run, rather than the concentration that we're beginning to see.
Okay, so let me circle back now from California across the Pacific back to Australia and give the word to Ron Masulis. Ron, you were there, the other Ron, you were there from the very beginning, and I think you heard what was said in Asia. Did any of these 3 themes resonate with you? Was there anything that was said in Asia that is sort of missing from this summary, or do you have anything to add? You need to be unmuted. We can't hear you. Yeah, you're not, no? We can't hear you. We're live. No, we can't hear you.
Yeah, we've all heard this, been in this position before.
You're not unmuted. It must be your microphone. No. Jennifer, do you want to come in on this? Okay. There's Jennifer.
I think we see Ron. Yes.
Okay.
Ah, there he is. He's taking Jennifer's seat.
Okay, Jennifer will be here momentarily. Let me just make one overall issue, or raise one issue that I think I haven't heard too much talked about, but I think in the last, given this crisis, one thing that's very dramatically different is the power of the government and the amount of resources the government is now utilizing to supposedly try and keep economies moving forward. I think that raises all kinds of potential conflicts of interest for politicians that are going to be allocating huge amounts of money across the economy and to different sectors and to different firms within the economy. And the amount of oversight by citizens of those allocations, I think, is very weak at the moment, and something that would be very critical to try and start to get greater control over, at least through transparency of how those allocations are being made, and hopefully eventually by having some approval process by the legislature in these countries. But I suspect that much of it's going to be controlled, is going to be allocated by the executive without much oversight. And that's, I think, one major concern. Jen, we're good here. Come on in.
I can only echo that. I mean, I think my other big personal takeaway is that we have a kind of paradox, which is that some of these very large corporations, in fact, internalize a lot more about the welfare of the world than some of the governments do. So a lot of the corporates have, in fact, behaved in a much more inclusive, global way, in some sense, caring about the citizens of the world rather than some of the governments. And of course, in that second theme, as you said, Ron, governments intervening and moving all these large amounts of resources in a national interest, I mean, that is in fact worrying. And I think it came up a lot in Europe. We heard an example of masks being sequestrated and, these kind of things. So I think this is a theme that certainly resonates a lot in Europe. Okay, so I think we have 5 minutes left before we've done the tour around the world, starting, it's the other way around, starting there. We are now there and we're going back there. So I first turn the floor to Luca, who has something to say, and then Jennifer's going to have the last word.
Thank you, Margaret. Just we'll say a few words about why we had this 24-hour global webinar. And first and foremost, the idea was to have a way for the community of corporate governance scholars, practitioners, and policymakers to connect in this difficult and for some tragic time. And secondly, we wanted to circulate new ideas and to stimulate even more new ideas. If I can say that myself, I think we have accomplished these 3 goals. And if I want to be emphatic, I will add that it has been another small way of saying we are in this together, and only by working together can our societies, our countries get out of the crisis in good shape and ready to restart and thrive. I will skip some practical announcements about how we plan to publish as many contributions as possible from the various panels. The Oxford Business Law blog and the Columbia Law School Blue Sky blog welcome submissions from all the speakers and posts summarizing the working paper that were presented. And there will be an ECGI occasional working paper with these contributions. Finally, I have to thank, and I want to thank all the many attendees. all the speakers, the chairs, and especially the local organizers and their institutions. And I think this conference is an excellent example of the way ECGI works as a decentralized bottom-up network of high quality scholars to which ECGI offers some central coordination which helps things work smoothly. And this event, of course, would not have been possible without the relentless steer of ECGI. So let me therefore thank Mark Becht and Vanessa Koenig, but especially Elaine McParland, who put so much into this, and a lot of effort, commitment, and enthusiasm. We did this in only 17 days, and that's quite remarkable. I will only conclude by saying that so we like this so much that around mid-May we will have a 48 hours webinar. Settled, Elaine?
No.
Thank you for your attention. And Jennifer, if you'd like to say.
Thank you so much, Luca. It seems hard to believe it's 24 hours since I was sitting here before. I did exactly the opposite half of the marathon to Marco. So I got up to seeing Israel and then I went to bed. But I know many of you are very tired. I've just woken up here in Australia. And I woke up to a headline in the New York Times that said, COVID-19 is the end of the world economy as we know it. And I'm hoping that's not true. I think we've got tremendous insights over the last 24 hours. For those of you that didn't see the Australian session, we actually kicked off with my colleague from Monash University, Professor Stephen Turner, who was a microbiologist. And I took away from his talk the idea that this is not going away anytime soon, that we will be living with this virus for quite some time. And he even suggested it could become seasonal. So we do need to change the way we live. And I think the ideas that came out of this conference have been tremendous. The one big takeaway for me in the part of the 24 hours that I was there for, from Australia through to the end of Israel and through all of Asia, is no country is the same in this crisis. It's a two-tier, two-track crisis, a health crisis and a financial crisis. And the mitigation strategies for each are going to be critical in nations' survival of the crisis. And we are going to be test driving like crazy over the next year. I'm going to close with those words. I think it's been the most marvelous initiative. I really, take my hat off to you, Luca, for coming up with it, and then everyone, Elaine and Vanessa, for getting together to make it happen in such a short period of time. It has been fantastic. I would much rather be at a conference with you all in person, but this is not a bad second. So thank you all so much, and farewell from Australia. And thank you ECGI and GCGC.
Thank you, Jennifer, for kicking it off and for closing it off. Now, maybe just one last word on what to expect further from ECGI. So as Luca said, we're going to go away and take the material and think about it and put it out there for you to digest. And I think then we're going to go away and think whether there are any themes that have emerged from today that we can home in on in a more concentrated way, specific questions that we want to analyze. For example, what's the best role for governments to get involved and help? And what is best done by governance, and how can governments and the private sector work best to defeat this crisis? And let's be more optimistic, Jennifer, about our innovative colleagues from the various medical and hard sciences departments coming up with a solution. So thank you very much to everybody, and we'll see you either at the next ECGI seminar or maybe at another marathon. Thank you.